I sat stiffly in the vinyl chair, my wool coat clutched tight against my chest as the nurse called my name. Behind me, my daughter's laugh sliced through the waiting room. "She won't last long." The words echoed louder than the buzzing lights overhead. After years of raising her alone, after every sacrifice carved into silence, I was nothing but a countdown in her eyes. "All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." Elaine sat stiffly on the edge of a vinyl chair in St. Luke's waiting room, her wool coat bunched tightly in her arms. The heating vent rattled overhead, blowing air that smelled faintly of disinfectant and overcooked coffee. Across from her, Rachel scrolled lazily on her phone, a glossy handbag balanced beside her ankle. Every few seconds, the impatient sighs escaping Rachel's lips seemed to puncture the silence, each one sharper than the last. Elaine tried to steady her breathing, counting in her head the way the therapist had once suggested. 4 seconds in. Hold for 2. Exhale for 6. Her fingers trembled anyway, the coat's fabric twisting beneath her grip. The room felt too bright, the fluorescent lights buzzing, amplifying every sound, the shuffle of magazines, the squeak of shoes on linoleum, the occasional cough echoing down the hall. "Mrs. Dawson?" a voice finally called. Nurse Alvarez, clipboard in hand, stood framed in the doorway. Her expression was professional, unreadable, but Elaine caught the faintest flicker of sympathy in her eyes. Elaine rose slowly, knees unsteady, and adjusted her grip on the coat. Before she could move forward, Rachel leaned sideways toward her husband's voice on the phone. She didn't bother to lower her tone. "She won't last long," Rachel muttered, with a cold laugh that snapped against the air like breaking glass. Elaine froze. The words lodged in her chest, heavier than the winter coat she clutched. Her stomach flipped, as though she'd swallowed ice. Every nerve in her body fired at once, but outwardly she didn't move, didn't speak. Her ears burned, yet her face remained expressionless. Nurse Alvarez cleared her throat gently, beckoning her forward. Elaine forced herself to step, her boots clicking against the linoleum in time with her pounding heartbeat. She kept her eyes on the doorway, refusing to glance back at Rachel, though the echo of those whispered words gnawed at her ribs. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and something metallic. Faint, but unmistakable. Elaine's vision narrowed as she followed the nurse. Her coat slipped slightly from her arms, the wool brushing her wrist, grounding her. Behind her, laughter floated again, Rachel's voice low and venomous, leaking into the sterile quiet. Inside the examination room, Elaine perched on the paper-covered chair. The crinkle beneath her made her flinch. Nurse Alvarez spoke kindly, though her tone carried a formality Elaine couldn't break through. Questions about symptoms, about pain. Elaine answered in clipped words, her mind still echoing with Rachel's cruel remark. "Try to relax," the nurse said softly while taking her blood pressure. The cuff tightened, squeezing her arm until her fingertips tingled. Elaine wondered if her face betrayed what she'd overheard, if the nurse could sense the storm swelling just beneath her skin. She remembered a dozen moments like this one, Rachel's hushed comments, the sideways glances, the pitying smiles when they thought Elaine couldn't hear. At family gatherings, at church, in grocery store aisles, always quiet enough to deny, but sharp enough to wound. Now, in this sterile room with its humming fluorescent lights, the words felt like a sentence carved in stone. "She won't last long." The nurse scribbled notes, unaware of the fissure widening inside her patient. Elaine pressed her palms against her thighs, grounding herself, hiding the tremor in her fingers. She bit down hard on her lower lip until the metallic tang of blood filled her mouth. When the door clicked open again, Elaine braced instinctively. A shadow crossed the floor, and Dr. Holloway stepped in. His expression was calm, but something unreadable lingered in his eyes as he greeted her. Elaine's gaze flicked from his hands to the folder he carried, then to the sterile counter lined with instruments. She nodded mechanically, words failing her. Every sound in the room seemed amplified: the scratching of his pen against paper, the squeak of the stool as he sat, the hollow thump of her pulse in her ears. Her mind replayed Rachel's whisper over and over, the syllables slicing deeper with each repetition. Not just cruel, confident, certain, as if Rachel already knew something Elaine didn't. "Elaine," Dr. Holloway began, his voice measured, "we need to discuss your latest results." Her throat tightened. She glanced at the folder in his hand, its edges sharp, its contents hidden. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in. Elaine clutched her coat again, fingernails digging into the fabric as though holding on could keep her from unraveling. Rachel's voice taunted her memory. Smug, dismissive, merciless. Dr. Holloway hesitated before opening the folder. The pause stretched, unbearable. Elaine drew a breath, steady but shaky, her mind caught between fear of what the folder contained and fury at what Rachel had already declared. The doctor finally looked up, meeting her eyes with an expression that made her heart seize. And before he spoke, the only thing Elaine could hear was Rachel's whisper, repeating like a curse she could not escape. Dr. Klein entered with an ease that immediately shifted the air. Where Dr. Holloway's posture had been clipped, Klein's carried the warmth of someone who had practiced patience for decades. His smile reached his eyes, softening the sterile atmosphere, though he kept his professional manner intact. "Elaine," he greeted, voice steady. "Thank you for waiting." She lifted her chin a fraction, forcing herself to nod, though her knuckles remained white against the fabric of her coat. The echoes of Rachel's whisper still lingered, like a stain she couldn't scrub out. Behind her, the door swung wider. Rachel strode in as if she belonged at the center of every room she entered. Her heels tapped in sharp rhythm against the tile, the sound commanding, slicing through the hush. She settled into the chair beside Elaine, handbag thudding onto the counter. Rachel didn't hesitate. "Doctor, I should tell you. Her decline has been rapid. She can barely keep food down. She doesn't admit how weak she's gotten. I think it's time we consider more aggressive measures." Elaine flinched, the words piercing deeper than any scalpel could. Her mouth opened, but before sound could escape, Klein lifted a hand, palm up, not dismissive but firm enough to redirect the current. "Let's hear from Elaine first." His tone carried a politeness that left no room for argument. Rachel's jaw tightened, lips flattening, her hands clasped around the strap of her bag, nails pressing into leather. She leaned back, though her eyes flicked with barely concealed irritation. Elaine swallowed hard. The paper beneath her shifted as she adjusted, and she realized the silence now belonged to her. Every instinct urged her to shrink, to retreat. But Klein's gaze anchored her. "I've been tired," she admitted, her voice low. "But I'm managing. More than they think." She glanced sideways at Rachel, the words barbed enough to draw invisible blood. Klein nodded, neither rushing nor pressing further. He turned to the folder on the desk, sliding out a crisp sheet of paper covered in graphs and neat columns of numbers. His pen tapped once against the margin, then stilled. "These are your most recent results," he said, his voice tempered with care. He rotated the page and pushed it across the desk, not toward Rachel, but directly to Elaine. The gesture, simple as it was, landed like a stone in a still pond. Elaine reached for the paper, fingertips brushing the edge, trembling as she pulled it close. The black ink blurred slightly before her eyes, not from poor vision, but from the rush of tears threatening to break free. She forced herself to read. Slowly, deliberately, she took in the figures, the ranges, the notes in Klein's precise handwriting. Her breath caught. Not terminal. Not failing. Strained, yes, Monitored, yes. But not the death sentence Rachel had whispered into existence. The swell inside her chest shifted. No longer fear, but something rawer, hotter. A spark. Rachel leaned forward, straining to catch a glimpse, but Klein's hand moved subtly, resting on the corner of the paper. He tilted his body ever so slightly, shielding Elaine's view from intrusion. "This is encouraging," he said gently, his words directed only at Elaine. "Your numbers show stability. Improvement, even, compared to 3 months ago." Elaine blinked hard, the tears finally escaping. Not from despair, but release. For the first time in months, her shoulders lowered, her lungs filling fully. She gripped the page as though it were a lifeline. Rachel's smile faltered. "That can't be right," she snapped, voice cracking through the quiet. She's been declining in front of us. You must have mixed up the files." Klein remained unshaken. "The data is clear." His eyes didn't leave Elaine's. "You've done better than anyone expected." Elaine's throat constricted, but this time it wasn't panic. It was power. For once, Rachel's voice didn't define her reality. The truth lay in her hands, spelled in numbers no whisper could erase. She folded the paper gently, slipping it into her coat pocket like contraband. Rachel reached forward as if to snatch it, but Elaine moved quicker, her palm firm against the pocket, her gaze sharp with unspoken defiance. The silence grew thick, heavier than the buzz of the fluorescent lights. Rachel's glare cut sideways, her nails tapping an angry staccato on the desk. For the first time in years, Elaine didn't flinch. Her pulse slowed, her spine straightened. Control, small, fragile, but undeniable, slid back into her hands. But just as the moment steadied, Klein's expression shifted. His eyes flicked to another page in the folder, something he hadn't yet shared. The warmth in his face cooled, replaced by a hesitation Elaine recognized too well. Rachel caught the change instantly, her lips curling into a triumphant smile. Elaine's fingers clenched around the folded paper in her pocket, heart hammering. Whatever came next would decide whether her brief taste of control was real or only borrowed. The car door slammed hard enough to rattle the frame, Rachel's anger filling the silence before the engine even turned over. Elaine eased herself into the passenger seat, careful not to let the folded paper slip from her purse. The seatbelt clicked across her chest. She sat still, eyes fixed on the frost gathering along the edges of the windshield. Rachel jerked the gear shift into reverse. "Unbelievable," she muttered. Tires crunched against gravel as she pulled out of the clinic's lot, knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Dragging me here, making me sit through all that, just to hear the same nonsense. Stable? Improving? Please. You wasted everyone's time." Elaine didn't answer. Her gaze followed the gray blur of bare trees outside, each branch etched against a winter sky. The town passed slowly, gas stations with flickering neon, the faded awning of the bakery she used to frequent, the pharmacy with its cracked parking lot. Every place seemed smaller, duller, yet more vivid in her silence. Rachel's voice pressed on. "You're not fooling anyone. We all see it. The way you stumble around, the way you sleep half the day. He humored you, that's all. Doctors do that. They soften the blow so people don't collapse in the office." Elaine shifted slightly, one hand tugging her purse closer to her lap. The results inside crackled softly, the paper's edge brushing her fingertips. She could almost hear Dr. Klein's calm tone, his certainty that improvement was real. Her daughter's words lashed like a whip, but Elaine didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the horizon, where the highway dipped into a stretch of open fields dusted white. Her mind drifted, not forward, but back. The memory came unbidden. Rachel at 8 years old, hair tied in a crooked ponytail, stomping across the kitchen in scuffed sneakers. "I hate you," she'd screamed, slamming the door after Elaine insisted homework came before television. Elaine had stood still in the kitchen, her husband's photograph above the mantel catching the afternoon light. He had been gone only a year then, taken in a sudden accident that left Elaine hollow. Every burden, mortgage payments, packed lunches, sleepless nights, had fallen on her shoulders. She worked double shifts at the diner, pressed uniforms late into the night, saved quarters in a jar just to keep Christmas from feeling empty. Rachel never knew the lengths her mother had gone, the sacrifices folded into silence. Elaine had raised her alone, shielding her from the jagged edges of grief. And yet, the girl had grown sharp, dismissive, thriving on control the way other children thrived on praise. Rachel's voice snapped Elaine back to the present. You think clutching that paper makes you strong? It doesn't. Independence is weakness. That's why you've always failed. You never let anyone take charge. Elaine's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Her fingers slipped inside the purse, brushing the folded results again. The paper felt alive, warm against her skin, like proof of something she had almost lost. The car bumped over a pothole, and Rachel's sigh filled the cabin. You can't keep pretending. We'll have to make arrangements sooner rather than later. Assisted living? Maybe hospice? You won't like it, but it's for the best. Elaine's stomach turned. She pressed her palm harder against the purse, grounding herself in its weight. The house appeared as they turned onto Sycamore Street. Elaine's small, weathered home stood at the end, shutters peeling, but the porch light already glowed in welcome. On the steps, Donna waited. Her neighbor of 20 years, wrapped in a thick cardigan, worry written plain across her face. Rachel pulled to a hard stop. Stay out of trouble, she ordered, not glancing at her mother as she reached for her phone. And don't go filling Donna's head with fantasies. She doesn't need to carry your burdens, too. Elaine unlatched the seatbelt and stepped out into the cold. The wind carried the faint smell of wood smoke, and for a moment, the world outside the car felt wider, freer. Donna rushed forward, taking Elaine's arm gently. I've been watching the clock, she said. How did it go? Elaine glanced back at the car. Through the glass, Rachel's face glowed blue in the light of her screen, already absorbed, already elsewhere. Turning back to Donna, Elaine lowered her voice to a whisper, words trembling like a secret she'd carried too long. She's already buried me. Donna's eyes widened, her grip tightening in quiet solidarity. Elaine pressed the purse closer to her side. The folded results lay hidden inside, a quiet promise that Rachel's prophecy wasn't the end. But standing there on the porch, beneath Donna's worried gaze, Elaine knew the paper alone couldn't shield her from what was coming next. Some battles would be fought in whispers, others would demand fire. Elaine hadn't meant to look inside the handbag. It was late afternoon, the house quiet except for the ticking wall clock and the hum of the refrigerator. Rachel had left her bag sprawled on the couch while she stepped into the kitchen, talking loudly on the phone with someone from her office. Elaine sat nearby, hands folded over her lap, trying to focus on the muted television. The bag had tipped slightly, its clasp loose. A glossy fold of paper stuck out from between receipts and a set of car keys. The colors caught her eye first. Blue sky, smiling retirees, a manicured lawn. She tugged it free before she had the chance to question herself. Across the top, silver pines, assisted living. Comfort, care, community. Her chest tightened, a painful squeeze that spread up into her throat. She unfolded it slowly, the cheerful photographs mocking her with their brightness. Couples strolled along garden paths. Elderly women laughed over watercolor classes. A tidy room with twin beds promised security and companionship. Rachel's voice floated from the kitchen. Of course we'll need to downsize. Mom's place is too much for her. The yard alone is a nightmare. I'll get the realtor lined up. Her tone was casual, almost breezy, like she was discussing grocery lists rather than her mother's home. Elaine's hands shook, the brochure trembling between her fingers. Betrayal landed sharper than fear, cold, merciless. Rachel wasn't planning for care. She was planning to erase her. When Rachel returned, Elaine shoved the pamphlet deep into the cushions. Her daughter set a mug of tea on the table as if nothing had happened. "We'll have to be realistic," Rachel said, brushing hair from her face. "That house is too much for you. Downsizing will make things easier for everyone." Elaine only nodded faintly, unwilling to betray the storm boiling in her chest. Later, when Rachel finally left for the evening, Donna slipped in through the back door carrying a container of soup. Elaine, still shaken, pulled the brochure from its hiding place and set it on the table. Donna's eyes widened as she skimmed the cheerful promises printed across glossy pages. "Don't you dare sign anything," Donna said firmly, her voice low but resolute. "Not a single line, Elaine. This isn't about your health. It's about control." Elaine pressed her lips together. She wanted to argue, to say her daughter wouldn't go that far. But the look in Rachel's eyes at the doctor's office, the smile when she saw Klein hesitate, it was all the answer she needed. Donna reached across the table, squeezing Elaine's hand. "You're stronger than she thinks. Don't let her write your ending for you." That night, after Donna had gone and the house had settled into silence, Elaine pulled the results envelope from her purse. She stood in the kitchen, the dim bulb above the sink casting pale light across the counters. She opened the drawer where she kept her checkbook and tucked the envelope inside, beneath old bills and a stack of coupons. For safekeeping. For herself. But even hidden, she couldn't let it rest. Near midnight, when the world outside was still, she crept back to the drawer. The paper felt cool against her fingertips, steady, reassuring. She unfolded it on the kitchen table, her eyes lingering over each figure, each phrase Klein had explained. Stable. Improving. Her tears came softly this time, not frantic but cleansing. Every word contradicted Rachel's whisper. Every number defied the narrative of decline. Elaine traced the ink with her finger as though the letters themselves held power. And then, in the quiet, a thought surfaced. A different kind of strength. Rachel wielded her cruelty loudly. Snide remarks, public dismissals, plans made in front of her without consent. Elaine had always met that fire with silence, retreating rather than confronting. But as she sat at the kitchen table with the proof in her hands, a new idea took shape. Silence didn't have to mean surrender. It could be a shield. A weapon. She folded the results carefully, sliding them back into the envelope. She pressed it flat against her palm, her reflection faint in the window glass above the sink. The night outside was dark, her own face staring back at her. Older, yes, but not finished. A new resolve settled in her bones. Quiet, but immovable. Rachel thought she'd already buried her. Let her think that. Let her underestimate. Elaine slid the envelope back into the drawer and closed it with deliberate care. Tomorrow, she promised herself, the silence would begin to work in her favor. And Rachel would never see it coming. Rachel's home looked as though it belonged in a magazine spread. White pillars, spotless siding, a broad lawn cut into precise lines by a riding mower. Yet as Elaine followed her daughter up the stone walkway, a chill crawled over her skin. The grand facade reminded her less of warmth and more of a display case. Beautiful, but brittle. Inside, the entryway gleamed with polished tile. A crystal chandelier hovered above, casting fractured light across the walls. Everything sparkled. But the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something stale, like air that had been scrubbed too many times. "Take your shoes off, please," Rachel said automatically, slipping hers neatly onto a rack. She spoke without looking back, already moving toward the kitchen. Elaine bent to unlace her boots, her joints stiff, her purse pressed tightly against her side. In the kitchen, Glossy countertops gleamed beneath recessed lights. Stainless steel appliances lined the walls, their surfaces reflecting distorted slivers of her face. On the island sat a neat stack of envelopes. The top one, angled slightly, revealed a red stamp across its front. Past due. Elaine's eyes flicked over the others. Electric, water, mortgage, all unopened, their edges curled faintly from neglect. Rachel noticed her gaze and swept the stack aside with a swift movement, tucking them under a recipe book. "Everything's perfect here," she said, too quickly. She opened the fridge, pulled out a bottle of sparkling water, and poured it into a glass. The fizz filled the silence, sharp and insistent. Elaine lowered herself into one of the high-backed chairs at the table. The cushion was firm, unused. She rested her hands on her lap, hiding the tremor that came not from weakness, but from the truth settling in. Rachel's life of control had cracks, fine but widening. Her daughter slid the glass across the table with a practiced smile. "You'll feel better once the house is behind you. That place is too much for you to manage. The stairs, the yard, it's falling apart." Elaine's chest tightened. She pictured her bungalow, the lilac bush that bloomed stubbornly each spring, the quilt draped across the sofa that she'd stitched by hand in the lonely years after her husband's death. Every corner carried the weight of memory. To Rachel, it was crumbling wood and liability. To Elaine, it was the last proof of a life she had built with her own hands. "You can't hold on forever," Rachel continued, folding her arms across her immaculate blouse. "We could sell it now, before the market drops. Use the money wisely, get you settled somewhere safe. Silver Pines would handle everything. You wouldn't have to lift a finger." Elaine's fists clenched under the table. She kept her face neutral, her silence steady. The edges of the results envelope, still hidden at home in her kitchen drawer, seemed to press against her memory like a secret oath. Rachel misread the silence as compliance. She leaned closer, her smile tightening. "It's the sensible thing. I'll make the calls. We can list it by spring." Elaine's eyes dropped to the smooth surface of the table, its reflection warping her daughter's face. The rage inside her burned hot but quiet, controlled in a way it had never been before. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper, soft enough to seem fragile but sharp enough to cut. "Not yours to sell." Rachel blinked, startled. Her smile faltered for the briefest second before snapping back into place. But Elaine had seen it. The crack, the flash of uncertainty. The chandelier above them glittered with fractured light, and Elaine sat straighter in her chair. For the first time in years, it was Rachel's turn to feel the silence pressing in. The phone rang just after dusk, when Elaine was setting a kettle on the stove. The shrill sound startled her, echoing through the small bungalow. She dried her hands on a dish towel and reached for the receiver, bracing for Rachel's clipped tone. But the voice on the other end was steadier, measured. "Mrs. Dawson? It's Dr. Klein." Her stomach tightened. "Doctor? I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to speak with you directly. Privately." His voice carried the same gentleness she'd heard in his office, but beneath it was something else. Hesitation, perhaps even concern. Elaine sat down at the kitchen table, the towel still clutched in her hands. "Of course. Is something wrong?" He paused. "Not medically. I need to inform you about a conversation I had earlier today. Your daughter reached out to my office. She requested to be given full authority over your medical decisions." Elaine's breath caught. The room seemed to tilt, the kettle's faint whistle in the background suddenly too loud. She what?" "She claimed you were in decline, that you weren't able to make informed choices for yourself. I told her I could not honor that request. You've demonstrated full competence. Your judgment is intact. Only you decide your course of care." Elaine pressed a trembling hand against her lips, relief and fury battling inside her. Rachel hadn't just whispered her death into existence. She'd tried to sign it into law. "Thank you," Elaine managed, her voice thin. "Thank you for telling me." Klein's tone softened further. "You should be cautious. It's not uncommon for family to push too hard in situations like this. But it's your right to direct your own treatment. Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise." Her throat tightened with gratitude, but also with something heavier. She murmured her thanks again before ending the call. The dial tone hummed in her ear long after she set the receiver down. The kettle screamed now, steam curling into the air. She switched off the burner and let the silence fall thick again. Rachel wanted everything: her health, her body, her house, control of the present and the future. Elaine sat perfectly still, her mind racing faster than it had in years. Her gaze slid to the kitchen drawer where the results envelope rested under check stubs and coupons. Proof of her strength, of the lie Rachel spun, proof she could still fight. She thought of Rachel's words at the doctor's office, the smug tilt of her smile. The brochure hidden in her handbag, the past due envelopes on her spotless kitchen counter. Every piece clicked together, a picture forming sharper than she wanted to admit. This wasn't about love, it wasn't even about care, it was about ownership. Elaine rose from her chair, her joints stiff but her movements purposeful. She crossed the room to the small roll-top desk she hadn't opened in months. Dust clung to its grooves. She pulled it back with a firm hand, the wood creaking in protest. Inside, yellowing manila folders sat in uneven stacks: property deed, insurance papers, her will, her bank statements. She laid them carefully across the table one by one. Her hands were steady now. For the first time in years, she wasn't shrinking from Rachel's shadow. She was stepping into her own. She whispered aloud, the sound small but fierce in the quiet kitchen. "She won't take this from me." The results envelope joined the pile. She smoothed it flat against the table, the inked numbers gleaming faintly in the overhead light. Her fingers lingered over it, her resolve hardening with every breath. If Rachel thought she was weak, let her keep thinking it. If Rachel believed she had already buried her, let her dig her own grave with that arrogance. Elaine's silence had always been survival, but now it would become strategy. Her eyes lifted to the window above the sink. Outside, the street lamps glowed dimly against the snow. Her reflection stared back at her, sharper than before, her features carved with quiet defiance. She gathered the papers into a neat stack, aligning every edge with meticulous care. This was no longer about defending herself. It was about outmaneuvering her daughter before the knife of betrayal could fall again. The drawer closed with a final click. Tomorrow, she promised, she would take the first step, and Rachel would never know what was coming until it was far too late. The roll-top desk opened wider this time, its wooden groan no longer daunting but purposeful. Elaine pulled every folder free, laying them across the dining table in uneven stacks. Her will, the property deed to the bungalow, insurance policies, bank statements, even the old savings account ledger she hadn't touched in years. The paper carried the faint must of age, some sheets yellowed, others curling at the corners, but together they looked like weapons sharpened over decades of living. A knock at the back door made her pause. Donna stepped in, brushing snowflakes from her cardigan. She took one look at the spread of documents and raised her brows. "Well," she said, setting down a thermos she carried. "Looks like somebody's getting serious." Elaine gestured to the papers with a small, tight smile. "If she wants control, she'll have to claw it out of my hands, and I'm not letting her." Donna pulled up a chair and began to sort, her hands deft, practical. She stacked the policies together, placed the deeds in one pile, bank records in another. Elaine fetched an old binder from a shelf, its plastic cover cracked, and set it on the table. They worked in silence at first, the only sound the rustle of pages and the faint hiss of the radiator. Then Donna unscrewed the thermos and poured steaming tea into 2 mugs. "Drink," she said, sliding one across. "You'll think clearer with warmth in you." Elaine sipped, the chamomile sweet and calming. For a moment their eyes met, and something like laughter bubbled between them. It came unexpectedly, soft at first, then spilling out. Laughter that masked the fear but also cut through it, reminding Elaine she wasn't entirely alone in this battle. Donna dabbed her eyes with her sleeve, grinning. "If anyone told me I'd be spending a Friday night making war plans at your kitchen table, I'd have called them crazy." Elaine smiled back, the tension in her shoulders easing for a heartbeat. But her hands never stopped moving. She reached for the results envelope from the drawer, smoothing it flat against the table before sliding it into a clear sleeve. "This," she said, voice quiet but firm, "goes on top." They copied it twice at the old printer in the corner. Each page whirred out slowly, the machine complaining with age, but the black ink came out sharp. Elaine stacked the copies with care, placing one in the binder, another in a separate envelope she tucked under a stack of bills. Donna watched her with an approving nod. "Sometimes silence isn't weakness," she said, her voice carrying a weight that hushed the room. "It's a strategy. Let her underestimate you. Let her walk right into her own trap." Elaine's chest lifted with a slow breath. Those words slid into her like armor. She reached for a pen, uncapped it, and began drafting notes on a yellow legal pad. Names of lawyers she knew from town, questions about updating her will, reminders to check her accounts. Her handwriting wavered but grew steadier line by line, determination threading each word. Outside, the first flakes of snow drifted past the window, soft and deliberate. The street lamp haloed them in pale light, a quiet promise of new beginnings. Elaine glanced at it briefly, her lips pressing into a line, not of sorrow this time, but of resolve. Donna leaned back in her chair, sipping her tea. "She thinks she's got you cornered, but corners can turn into walls if you build them right." Elaine placed the pen down, flexing her stiff fingers. She looked over the binder, now filled with proof of her life, her competence, her strength. It wasn't finished yet, but it was growing, layer by layer, like bricks in a fortress. She closed the cover with a firm hand. The snap of plastic echoed in the kitchen, louder than it should have. For the first time in years, Elaine didn't feel like prey. But as she stared at the binder, a thought wormed in. If Rachel discovered even a hint of what she was preparing, the war would explode before Elaine was ready. The snow outside thickened, covering the street in silence. Elaine reached for the binder again, pulling it closer as though it might be snatched away. Her next move had to be precise, deadly precise. Rachel's dining room glimmered under the chandelier, each bulb blazing too bright, reflecting off polished silver and glass. The table stretched long, dressed in cream linens, plates set with meticulous care. Elaine sat at one end, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the aroma of roasted chicken and rosemary potatoes heavy in the air. Rachel moved about like a hostess in command of her stage, pouring wine, refilling bowls, her smile sharp as glass. "We've been thinking about spring," she said, sliding a dish toward Elaine without meeting her eyes. "It's the perfect time for transitions. Fresh air, new routines." Elaine lifted a fork, steadying her hand as she scooped a small bite of potatoes. She chewed slowly, gaze lowered, letting her daughter's words float above her like smoke she refused to inhale. At Rachel's side, Mark sat stiffly, his napkin crumpled in his fist. He nodded at his wife's remarks, but his eyes flickered often toward Elaine, uneasy. His fork scraped against the plate as if trying to fill silence before it grew too heavy. Rachel continued, her voice sweetened with false warmth. "It's not just about safety, of course. It's about community. Imagine the relief of knowing she's cared for every hour of the day. She spoke of her mother as though she weren't sitting at the table, her tone rehearsed, a sales pitch sharpened through repetition. Elaine took another bite, slower this time, letting the flavors settle on her tongue. She kept her eyes on her plate, her lips pressed into a line that might have passed for weariness. Inside, though, her mind ticked with precision, her binder and notes waiting at home. Every paper a shield Rachel didn't know existed. Mark cleared his throat. Maybe we should talk it through. It's a big decision. Rachel shot him a look that silenced him mid-sentence. There's nothing to debate, she said crisply. Mom knows she can't handle that house anymore. It's too much. It's falling apart. Elaine finally lifted her gaze, meeting her daughter's eyes across the candlelit table. Rachel's smile was wide, triumphant, but Elaine's expression remained unreadable. She set her fork down with deliberate gentleness, folded her napkin, and simply smiled, a faint curve of lips, a flicker of amusement. Rachel blinked, momentarily unsettled. Then, mistaking the silence for surrender, she leaned back in her chair, victorious. See? She understands. It's the right choice for everyone. Elaine's smile lingered just long enough to sting before she lowered her eyes again, returning to her plate as though the conversation no longer concerned her. Mark shifted, his discomfort filling the pause. He sipped his wine too quickly, coughed, then mumbled something about the weather. Rachel ignored him, basking in her own certainty, but Elaine's silence was no longer retreat. It was patience, sharpened into something far more dangerous. Each word Rachel spoke only tied the rope tighter around her own throat. As the plates clinked and conversation drifted to Mark's work, Elaine sat in her chair, the faint smile still playing at her lips. She had learned something crucial tonight, that Rachel could not resist declaring her victory before the battle had even begun, and that arrogance would be the very crack Elaine needed. The pews gleamed with polish, their wood catching the soft glow of stained glass as sunlight slanted across the sanctuary. Elaine sat near the aisle, hymnal open in her lap, her gloved hands resting gently on its spine. The choir's voices floated down from the loft, warm and practiced, yet her focus stayed on the stillness inside her chest. Rachel stood just a few seats away, bustling with energy as she chatted with Mrs. Whitcomb and a cluster of women from the congregation. Her voice carried, sharpened just enough to be heard beyond her circle. "It's been such a challenge," she said with a rueful smile, "managing Mom's care, keeping her safe, making the hard choices, but I'll do what's necessary, even when she can't see it." The women clucked their tongues in sympathy. One leaned in, touching Rachel's arm. "You're such a good daughter. Not everyone steps up like that." Another glanced toward Elaine, her expression full of pity, as though she were already half a ghost. Elaine met the gaze calmly, her lips curling into a serene smile. She shifted her hymnal slightly, as if adjusting her grip, but inside she felt the binder back home like a fortress waiting. From the end of the pew, Donna leaned closer, her whisper threading through the music. "They'll know soon enough." Elaine didn't answer. Her smile deepened, almost imperceptibly, as she turned a page in the hymnal. The paper crackled softly, a sound lost under the swell of organ notes that rolled through the sanctuary. The congregation rose together, voices lifting with the melody. Elaine's voice was faint but steady, threading through the harmony. Rachel sang too, her tone loud, assertive, glancing down the row every so often as if to ensure her mother was following her lead. She never noticed the stillness in Elaine's gaze, the quiet steel beneath her softened smile. When the hymn ended, everyone kneeled, the hush settling like a blanket over the room. Elaine bowed her head, the wood of the pew cool beneath her clasped hands. But her prayer was not for endurance anymore. It was for clarity, for timing. She could feel Rachel's pride radiating beside her, the certainty that she had secured her role as savior in the eyes of the town. Elaine's pulse slowed instead of quickening. She was calm in her secret, wrapped in the knowledge Rachel had not yet glimpsed, that the narrative was shifting beneath her feet. The organ swelled again, a triumphant chord filling the sanctuary. Elaine lifted her head, her eyes catching the colored light spilling across the floor. She saw the reds and golds flicker across her gloved hands, and she almost smiled. Beside her, Rachel fussed with her coat, whispering plans for lunch, already rehearsing the next boast she'd deliver at the fellowship hall. Elaine pressed her hymnal closed with a soft thump. Her mind was already elsewhere. On the papers tucked safely at home, on the lawyer's name scrawled on her notepad, on the moment when silence would end and her voice would rise, not fragile, but final. She breathed in the music, letting it wash over her. The time was drawing close. When she looked up again, Rachel was still preening, still blind to the shift unfolding right beside her. Elaine's smile lingered, but this time it carried the weight of a promise. The reveal was coming. And Rachel would hear it echo louder than any organ. The knock rattled the bungalow's front door before Elaine could even rise from her chair. Rachel didn't wait for permission. She swept inside with a gust of cold air, her heels snapping against the worn hardwood. She carried a slim leather folder under one arm, the kind Elaine knew too well from years of paperwork at the bank. "Mom, we need to be efficient," Rachel said briskly, brushing snow from her coat. "I've brought everything we'll need to get started." Elaine stayed seated in her armchair, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the lamp beside her casting a soft glow across the room. She folded her hands neatly in her lap and waited. Rachel snapped open the folder, sliding out a neat stack of papers. The pages were crisp, official-looking, with lines for initials and signatures. She set them on the coffee table in front of her mother and tapped the top sheet with a manicured nail. "These are preliminary agreements for Silver Pines. Nothing binding yet, just authorization so they can reserve a space. If we act quickly, you'll have the best options. I'll handle the details. You just need to sign." Elaine leaned forward slightly, squinting at the dense paragraphs. The words blurred deliberately. She let her eyes wander over them as if struggling. She reached for her glasses, slipping them on, her expression patient, puzzled. Rachel shifted in her seat, impatience seeping through the cracks of her practiced smile. "It's all standard language. You don't have to understand every line, just trust me." Elaine tilted her head. She murmured, her voice slow, measured. "So many pages." Rachel exhaled sharply, her sigh filling the room. "Mother, we don't have time for this. You won't last long, not on your own. You're making this harder than it needs to be." The words landed like a blade, slicing through the quiet. For an instant, Elaine's chest constricted, the familiar ache of betrayal flaring hot. But outwardly, she didn't move. Her face remained smooth, her eyes fixed calmly on the paper as though she hadn't heard. Rachel mistook the stillness for weakness. "I'll leave these with you tonight. Go over them if you want. But we need your signature soon. The sooner we do this, the better for everyone." She gathered her coat with a snap, slipping the folder back under her arm. "Try to be reasonable. I'll check back tomorrow." Without another glance, she strode toward the door, her heels echoing in the small space. The door shut behind her, and silence reclaimed the bungalow. Elaine sat unmoving for a long moment, the papers left behind on the coffee table, their edges glinting in the lamplight like teeth. Finally, she rose. Her joints protested, but her movements were steady. She gathered the stack into her hands, the weight heavier than the thin sheets should allow. She carried them into the kitchen, where the old brick fireplace flickered faintly with the remnants of a morning fire. She knelt carefully, feeding the first page into the flames. The edges curled black, the text disappearing in a rush of orange. She slid in another, and another, until the entire stack was swallowed by fire. The smell of singed paper rose, sharp and acrid, filling the room. Elaine leaned closer, the flames reflecting in the lenses of her glasses, twin sparks in the dim kitchen. Her lips pressed into a thin line, not of grief, but of resolve. The crackle of burning pages was soft, but in her mind it roared like victory. Rachel believed she had cornered her, pressed her against inevitability. But these papers, reduced to ash, proved otherwise. Elaine straightened, brushing soot from her hands. The binder waited on the table, her own fortress of truth and strategy. She set her glasses on her nose more firmly, watching the last ember collapse. Her silence was no longer passive. It was fire. And soon, Rachel would learn exactly what it could destroy. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday, its cream paper stamped with certified mail in bold red across the front. Elaine retrieved it from the slot with steady fingers, the cold air nipping her skin as she carried it inside. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from anticipation. At the kitchen table, she slid it open with the edge of a butter knife. Inside lay a single sheet of thick paper embossed with Dr. Klein's letterhead. She read slowly, the words deliberate and weighty. Confirmation that her recent results showed stability, improvement, no sign of cognitive impairment. The phrasing was careful, but unshakable. She was competent. She was not in decline. She was in control of her own care. Elaine let out a long, measured breath. She folded the letter neatly, slid it into a plastic sleeve, and tucked it into the binder, resting it atop the medical charts and deeds like the crown jewel of her quiet arsenal. She sat back in her chair, letting her hand rest on the cover of the binder. It felt heavy, fortified, like a fortress with walls Rachel could not climb. But fortresses drew sieges. 2 mornings later, the storm came. Elaine was rinsing dishes when she heard Rachel's voice outside, the slam of a car door, the purposeful click of heels across her walkway. Elaine dried her hands slowly, waiting. The door burst open without a knock. Rachel held an envelope in her fist, the twin to the one Elaine had received days earlier. Her face was flushed, her voice a hiss. "Care to explain this?" She waved the paper, the motion sharp enough to slice the air. Elaine looked at her daughter calmly, then at the letter now crumpling under Rachel's grip. "Certified mail," she said softly. "Doctors like to be thorough." Rachel's jaw tightened. "This makes you look," she faltered, her breath catching on the word. "Capable. Independent. That's not accurate. You've been fading for months." Elaine's gaze didn't waver. She adjusted her glasses, her expression serene. "I know more than you think." The words landed like a stone dropped in a still pond. Rachel's breath hitched. For once, her confidence faltered. She opened her mouth to retort, but nothing came. Her hand trembled around the envelope, the paper crinkling as though it too couldn't withstand the pressure. For a long, brittle moment, the two women stared at each other. Elaine's silence pressed in, thick and unyielding, until Rachel broke first. "Fine," she spat, tossing the letter onto the table. "But don't think this changes anything. You can't keep pretending forever." She spun on her heel, her exit as sharp and clipped as her entrance. The door slammed behind her, rattling the glass panes. Elaine sat down at the table, smoothing the creases from the abandoned envelope. Her hands no longer shook. She slipped the letter back into the binder, closing it with deliberate care. The fire inside her had grown. Rachel had come storming in, expecting weakness, only to find a wall she hadn't seen coming. The crack had appeared. Not in Elaine, but in Rachel. That evening, Donna stopped by with a casserole. Elaine told her what had happened, her tone calm, almost detached. Donna's eyes widened, then narrowed in satisfaction. "That was the first crack," she said, setting the dish on the counter. She can't stand not being in control. Keep pressing, and she'll shatter herself. Elaine's lips curved into a thin smile. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers resting lightly on the binder's cover. Then we'll let her keep pushing. Outside, the wind rattled against the windows, snow swirling under the street lamp. Inside, the binder sat at the center of the table, thick with proof, each page another stone in the wall Elaine was building. Her daughter believed she could write her ending. Elaine knew better. And soon, the silence she wielded would speak louder than Rachel's every boast. Rachel summoned them to her house on a Saturday afternoon, the air outside brittle with frost. Elaine arrived with her binder tucked neatly into her purse, her steps measured, her silence deliberate. Mark greeted her at the door with a nervous half-smile, his tie loosened as though he'd been tugging at it all morning. Rachel stood in the living room, framed by the picture window that overlooked her immaculate lawn. Her arms were crossed, her jaw tight, the tension in her shoulders visible even from across the room. The polished hardwood gleamed, but the stack of unopened mail still lingered on the sideboard, half hidden beneath a decorative bowl. "Mom," Rachel began, her voice already sharp, "we need to talk about your behavior." She gestured toward the sofa, directing Elaine to sit. This secrecy, this refusal to cooperate, it's reckless. You're risking everything by pretending you can handle it alone." Elaine lowered herself onto the sofa, smoothing her skirt, her face calm. She placed the binder on her lap without opening it. Her eyes moved from Rachel's clenched fists to Mark's uneasy posture, but she said nothing. Rachel pressed on, her voice growing louder. "Do you realize the position you're putting me in? I'm trying to make the right choices for you, and you're undermining me at every turn. Silver Pines could have been settled by now if you'd just signed." Elaine lifted her chin, finally speaking, her voice even. "I've made my choices." Rachel barked a laugh, incredulous. "Your choices? Mom, you can't even keep track of your medication half the time. You think you can manage deeds, finances, long-term care? You're not being realistic." Mark shifted in his chair, his eyes flicking between the two women. "Maybe we should," he started, then stopped as Rachel shot him a glare. Elaine's hands moved with precision. She unzipped her purse, pulled out the binder, and placed it squarely on the coffee table. The plastic cover reflected the chandelier's light, the thick stack of organized documents unmistakable. Rachel frowned, her tone dripping with condescension. "What's this supposed to be?" Elaine opened the binder. One by one, she laid the pages flat, the doctor's certified letter of good health, the deed to her bungalow, the bank statements, the insurance policies, the notes to her lawyer. Her fingers lingered on each page as though setting cards in a game only she knew how to play. "This," Elaine said, her voice low but steady, "is proof. Proof that I am competent. Proof that this house, my house, remains mine. Proof that you cannot take what I've built." Rachel's face drained of color, the blood leaving her cheeks as she scanned the pages. Her lips parted, but no words came. Mark leaned back slowly, folding his arms across his chest. His gaze slid from the binder to his mother-in-law, then to his wife. For the first time, his expression shifted. Not pity, not doubt, but something closer to admiration. Rachel tried to recover, her voice strained. "Paperwork doesn't change the truth. You're not as strong as you think. You need help." Elaine met her daughter's eyes, her tone cool, controlled. "I am not leaving my home." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Rachel's breathing grew shallow, her fists curling at her sides. Mark looked away, as though embarrassed by the scene. Elaine closed the binder with a snap that echoed through the polished room. She slid it back into her purse with deliberate calm, then rose to her feet. Rachel stepped forward, her voice breaking through clenched teeth. You think this will stop me? Elaine adjusted her glasses, her face unreadable. I don't need to stop you. You'll stop yourself. Rachel froze, stunned by the words. For the first time, her certainty faltered in full view. And in that charged silence, Elaine turned toward the door, her purse pressed to her side like a shield. The war had shifted. Rachel's composure shattered the moment Elaine's hand touched the doorknob. You're ruining everything, she screamed, her voice ricocheting off the polished walls. The sharpness startled even herself. Her usual veneer of control cracked into raw fury. She stepped forward, trembling with rage. You think your little binder makes you strong? You're destroying all the work I've done to keep this family afloat. Elaine turned slowly, her purse still pressed against her hip. She said nothing. Her eyes moved to Mark, who sat frozen in the armchair, his expression clouded with confusion. What work? He asked cautiously, his voice low, steady. Rachel, what is she talking about? Rachel's face blanched, then flushed crimson. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then shot a glare at Elaine, as though her mother's silence had forced the trap closed. You don't understand, she stammered. The house, the bills. It's complicated. Mark stood, the chair groaning beneath him. No, he said firmly. I don't understand, and I think you'd better explain. Rachel's fists clenched at her sides. Fine, she spat, her voice cracking. We're in debt. Bad debt. The house isn't paid off, the credit cards are maxed, and if I don't fix this, we'll lose everything. That's why I needed Mom's place. Selling it would solve all of it. The confession hung in the air, heavy as stone. Mark's eyes widened, his mouth tightening into a grim line. He took a step back as though recoiling from the truth. Elaine lowered herself back onto the sofa with careful grace. She smoothed her skirt, adjusted her glasses, and folded her hands in her lap. Still silent, still calm. Rachel's breathing quickened. Say something, she demanded, her voice breaking. Don't just sit there, judging me with those eyes. You don't know what it's like to carry all this, to keep up appearances, to make sure people respect us. But Elaine didn't speak. She let her daughter unravel, word by word, rage collapsing into confession, pride curdling into desperation. Mark rubbed his temples. So all of this, he said slowly, wasn't about her health. It was about covering your mess. Rachel turned on him, her voice rising again. Don't you dare blame me. You knew about the bills piling up. You knew things were tight. What was I supposed to do? Let us drown? At least I had a plan. Mark's eyes flicked to Elaine, then back to his wife. A plan that involved lying to everyone? Pretending your mother was helpless so you could take her house? Rachel's face twisted, fury and shame warring in her expression. She is helpless, she shouted, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the lie. Elaine shifted slightly, her purse strap sliding against her shoulder. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. Rachel saw it and nearly choked. You think you've won, don't you? She screamed, her voice breaking. You've always looked down on me. You don't care about what I've sacrificed. You don't care that I've held this family together while you've just... Her words dissolved into a ragged sob. Elaine's stillness was answer enough. Donna, who had slipped in quietly after a neighborly knock was ignored, stepped closer to Elaine's side. Her voice was soft but firm, the weight of truth carrying each syllable. Rot always starts in the dark. Eventually, it comes out where everyone can see it. Rachel's breath hitched. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her coat, her movements frantic, jagged. You'll regret this, she hissed, her face wet with angry tears. You'll both regret this. She stormed toward the door, slamming it behind her so hard the chandelier rattled overhead. The echo lingered long after her footsteps faded down the walkway. The house grew still, the silence thick, but no longer oppressive. Mark sank back into his chair, his head in his hands, while Elaine sat perfectly upright, serene. Her eyes closed briefly, inhaling the calm that filled the room in her daughter's absence. Donna placed a gentle hand on Elaine's shoulder. "You held your ground," she whispered. "That was the crack we were waiting for. Now it'll spread." Elaine opened her eyes, her smile thin, resolute. "Yes," she murmured. "It will." The fire inside her burned steady, no longer just survival, but certainty. Rachel's mask had slipped, and once the world saw the truth beneath it, there would be no putting it back on. The knock came softly this time, nothing like Rachel's sharp assaults. Elaine rose from her chair, setting aside the novel she hadn't really been reading, and opened the door. Mark stood there, shoulders hunched against the cold, his tie absent, his face weary. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice low. Elaine nodded, stepping aside. He entered with none of his wife's usual force. He closed the door gently behind him, slipping out of his coat with an awkwardness that made him seem younger, more uncertain. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon from a candle Elaine had lit earlier. She gestured toward the table. "Sit," she said softly. "I'll make coffee." Mark obeyed, lowering himself into one of the wooden chairs. He rubbed his hands together, staring at the binder on the counter as if it might open on its own and reveal more truths. Elaine set water to boil, the kettle humming steadily between them. For a long while, neither spoke. Finally, Mark cleared his throat. "I came because I needed to say I'm sorry." Elaine glanced over her shoulder. His eyes were downcast, his fingers worrying the edge of a placemat. "Sorry for what?" she asked gently. "For not seeing it sooner." He exhaled, shaking his head. "Rachel, she's always had this need to control everything, to present a perfect image no matter what it costs. I ignored it, told myself it was just her way of coping. But when she started talking about your house, about Silver Pines, I knew something was off. I just didn't want to admit it." Elaine poured the coffee into 2 mugs, the rich scent filling the room. She set one in front of him before taking her seat across the table. "It takes courage," she said quietly, "to see what you've been pretending not to." He met her gaze then, and for the first time in years, she saw vulnerability in his eyes. Not weakness, but honesty. "I don't know what's going to happen between us," he admitted. "But I don't want to lose you in the middle of it." Bittersweet pride welled in Elaine's chest. She had raised Rachel alone after her husband's death, bearing every sacrifice in silence, but Mark had grown into his own kind of man, quieter, steadier. He had lived in Rachel's shadow, perhaps even bent to her will. But here he was, sitting across from her with nothing but truth. They sipped their coffee in silence, the steam rising in thin ribbons. The snow outside drifted steadily, softening the world into muted whites and grays. "You don't have to fix this," Elaine said at last, her voice firm. "That isn't your burden." Mark shook his head. "I want to help." She leaned forward, her hand resting on the binder. "No, son, listen to me. You don't need to fix this. I already did." The words hung in the air, solid and immovable. Mark studied her, his lips parting as though to argue, then closing again. Slowly, he nodded. Respect, not pity, settled into his features. "I believe you," he said simply. Elaine's chest loosened, the weight that had pressed against her lungs for months easing at last. She sat back in her chair, her hands wrapping around the warm mug. For the first time in years, she felt lighter, as though every page in that binder had shifted from defense to liberation. Mark stayed for another hour, their conversation gentle, circling old memories of childhood summers, laughter at small stories that had nearly been lost beneath years of tension. When he finally rose to leave, He bent to kiss her cheek. His voice was quiet but steady. "I'm proud of you, Mom." Elaine closed the door behind him and stood for a long moment in the hush of her kitchen. The snow outside caught the glow of the street lamp, each flake swirling with quiet purpose. She touched the binder, her fingers tracing its edge, and allowed herself a thin, steady smile. Rachel's mask had slipped. Mark had seen the truth. The crack was widening. But Elaine knew her daughter well enough to understand. When pride begins to collapse, it does not crumble quietly. It shatters. And the sound of that shattering was coming. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and old coffee, its sterile brightness softened only by the muted hum of morning. Elaine sat in the waiting room, her wool coat folded neatly across her lap, her posture straight, her expression calm. She no longer clutched the coat like a shield. It rested lightly in her hands, as though she carried it by choice, not necessity. Rachel sat across from her, phone in hand, scrolling furiously. She wore her best blazer, lipstick perfect, but her eyes darted to her mother every few seconds as if expecting some sign of weakness she could exploit. Elaine offered none. The door opened. "Mrs. Dawson?" Dr. Klein stood there, folder in hand, his kind eyes meeting hers first and only hers. Elaine rose without hesitation. Rachel pushed up from her chair too, heels clicking as she hurried to keep pace. Inside the exam room, the paper-covered chair waited, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Klein gestured for Elaine to sit. Rachel remained standing, arms crossed, as though her presence alone might dominate the space. Klein ignored her. He pulled a fresh set of test results from the folder, smoothing them on the desk. "Elaine," he said warmly, "I'm pleased to tell you everything looks stable. Some values have even improved. You've done remarkably well." He turned the papers toward her, sliding them across the desk. His hand didn't even flicker toward Rachel. Elaine reached forward, her fingers steady as she took the results. She slipped on her glasses, scanning the lines of numbers, the notes in Klein's tidy handwriting. She nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. Not as rescue, but as confirmation of what she already knew. Across the room, Rachel shifted, her mouth opening to speak. "Doctor, I think—" Klein didn't look at her. "I'm speaking to Elaine," he said gently but firmly. "These results are hers to review." The color drained from Rachel's face, her lips pressed tight. She sank into the corner chair, ignored for the first time in her carefully curated world. Elaine folded the results and slid them into her purse with deliberate calm. The gesture was small, almost ordinary, but in that silence it rang louder than any outburst. Her purse clicked shut, the sound final, unchallengeable. She looked at Klein, her eyes soft with gratitude. "Thank you, doctor," she said warmly, "for treating me as myself." Klein smiled. "As you deserve." The appointment ended quickly after that, routine instructions and pleasantries exchanged. But the weight of the moment lingered like a stone dropped into still water. When Elaine stood, Rachel scrambled to follow, her heels clicking frantically against the linoleum. Elaine didn't wait. She adjusted her coat across her arm and walked toward the hallway with measured steps, her head held high. The air smelled of disinfectant, of polish, of all the things Rachel had once used as evidence against her. Now those scents felt like background noise, meaningless against the proof folded in her purse. Rachel trailed behind, her voice sharp with forced authority. "This doesn't change anything," she hissed. "You still can't—" Elaine didn't turn. She moved steadily through the corridor, passing the bulletin board of flyers, the vending machines humming softly. She could hear Rachel's clipped breaths behind her, but she no longer felt hunted by them. At the sliding glass doors, the cold winter air rushed in, crisp and biting. Snow dusted the pavement, and the sky stretched pale and open above the parking lot. Elaine stepped forward first, the doors parting for her as though the world itself were making way. Rachel hurried to keep up, her words faltering into silence when she realized she was following, not leading. Elaine's hand brushed the purse at her side, feeling the folded paper secure within. She drew in a deep breath, the chill filling her lungs like fire. Her voice came as a whisper, but steady, unshakable. "I'll last as long as I choose." The words vanished into the winter air, but Elaine knew they would echo, through Rachel's silence, through her own home, through every page of proof she had built. The war was over, and Elaine had won it without raising her voice.